Help us hit our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support drives us to create even more wonderful stories. Thanks for being part of our journey. Chapter 1. Forgotten on the Roadside. The asphalt crackled underfoot from the heat. The sun didn't just shine. It scorched the sky above his head, leaving no shadow. Chris stood in the middle of the road, dusty, almost dead, and looked at something that no longer existed. Their car together, their marriage vehicle, as Rachel joked, had just disappeared. And with it, she, her friends, his phone, wallet, documents, map, and, it seemed, his former life. It was supposed to be a quick stop for coffee, a small diner with pulsating neon and a mint gum machine. He said, "I'll be right back, just to the bathroom." They smiled as usual, artificially, almost dismissively. And when he left, leaving the old, creaking toilet door behind him, the car was already driving away. Maybe it had even disappeared a minute before. Chris stood there in silence. No anger, no screaming. Just that empty, ragged breath of air when you don't know if you're dreaming or awake. His heart was pounding, but his legs were not moving. He stood there with his shoelace untied and an old t-shirt that still remembered the times when he had laughed genuinely. Not just pretended to be happy. He was still trying to find an explanation. Could they be joking? Maybe they'd be back in 5 minutes? But an hour passed, then another. No one returned, and it became clear that this was no joke. This was the end. He looked around. It was empty. The edge of a highway where even ghosts don't stop. His palms were sweating. His throat was dry. It was strange. He didn't know which way to go. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know. Chapter 2. Alone on the side of the road. Chris sat on the cracked curb of that forgotten gas station. The sun now lower but no less ruthless. His back ached from the heat, and the sweat on his neck had dried into itchy salt. He had nothing but his thoughts, and they were louder than the empty road in front of him. He kept staring down the highway, like the act of hoping could will the car to return. Like maybe Rachel would pop the trunk, laugh and say, "Gotcha." But the laughter never came, only silence, broken by the occasional hum of a distant car that never slowed for him. His wallet? Gone. Phone? Still charging in the dashboard when they drove off. All he had were the jeans he'd thrown on without thinking and a shirt he'd meant to throw away months ago. A shirt Rachel had called pathetic, once during an argument, and now it was all he had left. Chris got up, legs numb, and walked in a slow circle around the parking lot, his eyes scanning the horizon like a soldier stranded after a lost battle. He replayed the last few days. The trip, the laughter he wasn't invited into, the snide jokes from her friends, like when Carrie spilled wine on his lap and said, "Oops, hope that wasn't your only pair of pants." The others laughed, Rachel included. He laughed too. That fake kind of laugh that echoes in your ears long after everyone else has stopped. They didn't just leave him today. They'd been leaving him in small ways for years, and he'd ignored every sign. A beat-up pickup truck finally rolled into the lot, the engine coughing like it was on its last breath. The driver, a thick-set man with calloused hands and a quiet face, stepped out and nodded at him. "You all right, bud?" The man asked. Chris didn't know how to answer that. Was he all right? His life had just imploded on a dusty stretch of nowhere with no phone, no money, no ride. But he forced a nod, his voice low, cracked. "My wife. She left, took everything, even the car." The man stared at him a second longer, then gave a small grunt. "Well, you hungry?" Chris nodded, his throat tight. They sat in the bed of the truck, sharing a pack of beef jerky and a bottle of warm soda. No judgment, no pity, just two men, strangers, chewing in silence as the sun began to bleed into the horizon. Chris didn't ask the man's name, didn't offer his own. But for the first time that day, he didn't feel invisible. When the truck pulled away, disappearing into the dusk, Chris was left again with nothing. But something inside him had shifted. They had left him to rot, but he was still standing, and maybe that was the beginning of something. Chapter 3, The Shelter of Strangers. The town Chris eventually wandered into wasn't on any map he'd ever noticed before. Just a fading sign that said, "Welcome to Wetley Dash." Half covered in bird droppings and sun bleached to near white, his legs throbbed. His stomach twisted with hunger, and his skin burned from hours under the sun. He hadn't planned on walking this far, truth was. He hadn't planned anything since stepping out of that gas station bathroom and seeing nothing but empty space where their car had been. By the time he reached the edge of Wetley, it was late. Streetlights buzzed overhead, flickering in and out like they were just as tired as he was. He passed shuttered stores with dusty windows, a laundromat still lit but empty, and finally, a small building with a rusted cross nailed above the door, Hope Haven Shelter. It said in peeling paint. He almost walked past it. Almost pride told him to keep going. Pride said he could figure this out without help. But desperation spoke louder. Inside, it smelled like old socks and industrial-grade disinfectant. A woman behind the desk looked up from a newspaper, her eyes squinting at him like she'd seen the same scene 100 times. Maybe she had. "You need a bed or just a sandwich?" she asked. Her voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either, just practical. Chris hesitated. He didn't want a handout. He wanted his life back. He wanted Rachel to call and say it was a mistake, that she was sorry, that she loved him. But the silence in his pocket told him all he needed to know. Both. He finally said, "If that's okay." She nodded, not asking for his story. Maybe that came later. She slid him a clipboard and pointed toward a hallway lined with faded cots and thin blankets. The air was thick with tired breathing and quiet sobs from men who, like him, had lost more than they cared to explain. That night, lying on a sagging mattress with a blanket that smelled like bleach and sadness, Chris stared at the cracked ceiling tiles. The hunger in his belly was gone, but the hunger in his heart still gnawed at him. He thought about how far he'd fallen. Just 2 days ago, he was the guy holding bags for Rachel and her friends, the guy they teased and talked over. Now he was nameless, jobless, and sleepless in a stranger's bed, among men whose faces told him they had stories just as broken. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the grief, beneath the shame, a strange thought stirred. They left me, but I'm still here. They took the car, the phone, the money, but they didn't take me, not all of me, not what matters. Chris turned on his side, pulled the blanket tighter, and shut his eyes. Not to forget, but to rest. Tomorrow, he'd figure something out, not to win her back. Not anymore, but to win himself back. Chapter 4: The Diner and the Dish Pit. The next morning came fast and slow at the same time. Chris woke to the sound of shuffling feet and low coughing. The kind of background noise that feels like static in your soul. The cot creaked as he sat up, back aching from the thin mattress, his body reminding him this wasn't home, because he didn't have a home anymore. A cup of stale coffee waited for him in the shelter's small kitchen, poured by Roy, the guy who'd taken his name and given him a bed the night before. Roy didn't say much, just pushed the mug across the counter and nodded toward the door. "You're not the first to come in broken," he said, his voice as rough as the shelter towels, "but you don't gotta stay that way. There's a diner down on Harrison, owner's a tough old bird. If you want work, ask for Marta. Tell her Roy sent you." Chris didn't know why he listened. Maybe because Roy reminded him of the father figure he never really had. Maybe because he had no plan, no map, just the whisper of a chance. So he went. The diner wasn't much. A squat building with peeling red paint and a sun-bleached sign that simply said Marta's. The windows were fogged from the heat inside, and through the glass he could see a waitress with her hair tied up in a pencil bun, dodging between tables with plates stacked high. Chris stepped in and was hit with a wall of grease, coffee, and clinking silverware. It was loud. It was alive. It was everything his heart wasn't. Behind the counter stood Marta. Mid-60s, wiry arms, a faded tattoo of a rose on her forearm, and a scowl that looked permanent. "You Roy's stray?" she asked without looking up. Chris blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, he said you might need help." Marta sighed, dropped her rag, and pointed toward the kitchen. "Dish pit's back there. Guy quit last night, pays crap, hours or worse. But it's hot, it's steady, and it's yours if you don't steal, don't whine, and don't quit." Chris nodded before his brain could even catch up. "I'll take it." And just like that, his hands were in soap and steam, water burning his raw skin as he scrubbed plates stacked higher than his dignity. His shirt clung to him with sweat. His back screamed after just an hour, and his shoes soaked through on the slippery tile floor. But he didn't stop, because for the first time in days, maybe weeks, maybe months, he felt useful. No one here knew about Rachel. No one laughed behind his back. No one smirked when he spoke. It was just him and the dishes. And in a weird, exhausting way, it was peace. That night, Chris walked back to the shelter with dishwater still on his sleeves and the smell of bacon in his hair. His feet ached. His fingers were pruny, and there was a little envelope in his pocket. $47 in cash. His first earned money since she left him. He lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling again. But this time, his thoughts weren't full of her laugh, her cruelty, her betrayal. This time he thought about soap and plates and Marta's rough voice yelling faster. Rookie. Chapter 5: Ghosts in the Sink. Chris had been working at Marta's diner for a week now. The routine was simple, brutal, and strangely comforting. He'd wake up to Roy's gravelly voice and the smell of burnt toast in the shelter kitchen, shove down some day-old eggs, and make his way down Harrison to the little red building with the greasy windows. Every shift was the same. Dishes, water, steam, dishes, silence. But the silence wasn't always in the air, it was in his chest. Scrubbing plates kept his hands busy, but his mind still wandered, and it always wandered back to Rachel. He'd replay the day she left like it was a movie on loop. The motel, the suitcase, her turning away without flinching, the echo of tires on gravel as she disappeared into someone else's car. It haunted him, and now that ghost had followed him to the sink. It was a Thursday afternoon. The diner slow between lunch and dinner. Chris was elbow deep in suds when Marta slid a plate of fries across the counter and barked, "Break time?" He looked up, blinking. "I'm good." "You're not. Sit down before you pass out on my tile, and I gotta file paperwork." He obeyed, wiping his hands and sliding into the booth nearest the kitchen door. Marta sat across from him, nursing a black coffee like it was whiskey. "You're quiet, even for a dish guy," she said, eyeing him. "What's your story?" Chris stared at the plate in front of him. The fries were golden, perfectly crisp. The smell hit his stomach hard. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. "Got left," he muttered finally. "Wife, whole life, just gone." Marta didn't flinch, didn't offer pity. "Join the club," she said, sipping her coffee. "Mine left me for a woman who made dream catchers out of recycled soda cans. Took the cat, left the debt." Chris huffed a laugh, surprised by it. It felt foreign in his throat. "She ever come back?" Marta shrugged. "Couple years later. Wanted to be friends. I told her I already had one cat. Didn't need another that shits on everything." Chris laughed harder this time. A real laugh. The first since the motel. Marta didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "You're doing fine, kid," she said. "Just keep moving." That night, after his shift, Chris walked into a gas station and bought something small with part of his paycheck. A prepaid phone. It was cheap, plastic, and lit up like a Christmas tree when he turned it on. He stared at it for a long time in the shelter hallway, thumb hovering over the contacts. There were none. No saved numbers, no texts, no voicemails. It felt like staring into an empty room that used to be full of life. But just as he was about to turn it off, the screen lit up. Unknown caller. His heart skipped. He didn't answer. He let it ring, let it go to voicemail, let the silence fill the hallway like fog. Then it buzzed again. A message. He hesitated, then pressed play. Her voice filled the tiny speaker, sweet and trembling. "Chris, where are you? It was never supposed to go this far. I made a mistake. Please, call me back." His jaw clenched. He gripped the phone so hard his fingers went white. A mistake? She left him with nothing, and now she wanted back in. He stared out the window of the shelter at the distant lights of town. His reflection looked back at him. Tired eyes, cracked lips, soap-burned hands. For the first time since everything fell apart, he didn't feel small. He felt angry, he felt awake. The ghost in the sink wasn't haunting him anymore. It had knocked on the wrong door. And Chris? He was starting to remember what it felt like to slam that door shut. Chapter 6, Silence Isn't the Same as Peace. The next morning, Chris didn't touch his phone. He left it in his pocket, heavy like a stone. The voicemail still lingered in his mind. Rachel's voice trembling like a leaf in a storm, saying things he'd begged to hear back when they still shared a bed. But now it just sounded false, like a performance for a camera he couldn't see. He showed up at Marta's earlier than usual. The diner still smelled like last night's grease. The air quiet before the breakfast rush. Marta was already there. Hair pulled up, cigarette dangling between her fingers, though she never actually lit it indoors. "You sleep here or something?" she asked, not looking up from the register. Chris shrugged. Didn't feel like staying at the shelter. Marta squinted at him. "You okay?" "Yeah, a lie. Just needed to move." She didn't press. Just tossed him a rag. "Good, wipe down the booths. We've got eggs to fry and locals to tolerate." Chris moved through the diner like a ghost in a place he was slowly learning to haunt less, wiping, stacking, breathing. But his mind wasn't quiet. It was buzzing. Rachel's voice looped in his skull. Words that once meant the world now sounded like background static in someone else's life. She had left him without a car, without money, without even a damn goodbye that meant something. And now she was sorry? What was she sorry for? That he hadn't curled up and died in a ditch. That he hadn't come crawling back. That he was still standing? Chris dropped the rag and gripped the counter, breathing hard. The clatter of cups behind him brought him back. It was Marta. She was watching him again. "You look like you're about to murder the toaster." Chris blinked. "Sorry, just spaced out." "You do that a lot," she said. "You want coffee or a punching bag?" He gave a weak smile. "Both." Marta poured a cup. No sugar, no cream, just bitter and real. Chris sipped it, standing by the window, watching the street wake up. For a moment, he imagined Rachel walking through that door, makeup perfect, voice sweet, acting like none of it had happened, like it was all just a misunderstanding. And he imagined what he would say. But in that vision, he didn't say anything. He just turned his back. Because silence wasn't weakness anymore, it wasn't surrender, it was power. That afternoon, during his break, he pulled the phone out and tapped through to the voicemail again, just to test himself, to feel the weight of her words and realize they didn't carry the same punch they used to. He didn't listen to the end. He hit delete. Then he scrolled to her number. His thumb hovered. He could have blocked it, erased her from the device entirely. But something in him wanted to wait, not because he hoped she'd change, but because he wanted to see just how far she'd fall. And when the next message came, as he knew it would, he'd be ready not to reply, not to rage, just to know that she didn't own him anymore. Chris put the phone away. The bell above the diner door jingled. Another table to serve another dish to scrub another hour. One. Silence wasn't peace yet, but it was a damn good start. Chapter 7, The Hollow Message. The following week at the diner passed in a blur of clattering dishes, screeching chairs, and the sharp smell of grease. Chris tried to keep his head down, working double shifts and scrubbing pans until his knuckles turned red. But even as the rhythm of work dulled his thoughts, Rachel's voice kept bleeding into his mind, soft, apologetic, and hauntingly familiar. It wrapped around his thoughts like smoke, curling through every quiet moment. Every time the old doorbell jingled, his body flinched. He kept expecting her to walk in, not Rachel exactly, but the memory of her, the girl he once loved, the one who laughed beside him at diners just like this one, before the cracks started showing. One night after closing, Chris sat in the kitchen on an upturned milk crate. He was alone. Martha had left early with a curt, "Don't burn the place down." The lights buzzed overhead. He stared at his phone again. The voicemail from Rachel still there. He hadn't deleted it. He hadn't listened again either. It sat like a stone in his pocket. He debated pressing play, just one more time. But something held him back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear instead. He opened his messages. "Stephanie, 2 texts. You good, man? We didn't mean for it to go like that." That line hit him harder than he expected. We didn't mean for it to go like that. He almost laughed. They'd planned the whole thing. The lake house, the drive, the bathroom stop, the silence afterward. Chris tossed the phone across the counter, where it landed beside a cracked mug full of used pens. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. His fists clenched against his jeans. The anger wasn't hot anymore. It was something worse. A low, steady simmer that never left. He got up and started wiping down the counters again, scrubbing harder than necessary. He needed control of something, anything, because inside, he felt like he was still stuck at that dusty gas station, waiting for tires to crunch on gravel, waiting for someone to care enough to come back. But no one ever had, and now they wanted what? Forgiveness? A return to the past? He looked around the empty kitchen, the place that had become his shelter, his armor. And in that silence, Chris made a choice. He pulled the phone from the counter, opened the voicemail list, stared at Rachel's message for several long seconds, then hit delete. No fanfare, no drama. Just a thumb on glass, and then it was gone. Her voice, her guilt, her last shotgun. He set the phone down gently, like it was suddenly fragile. And for the first time since that day on the highway, his shoulders dropped just slightly. The weight wasn't gone, but it was less. He turned off the kitchen light and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, sharp against his skin. He zipped up his jacket and looked up. The stars were out, and for once, they weren't reminding him of her. Chapter 8. Cracks in the silence. 2 weeks had passed since Chris deleted Rachel's voicemail. Since then, the diner had settled into its usual rhythm. Same coffee-stained menus, same jukebox tunes warbling from the corner. But something inside him had shifted. He was still tired, still carrying scars that weren't visible. But for the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living, barely, awkwardly, but living. Martha had noticed, "You don't flinch every time that door opens anymore," she said one morning, sliding a tray of biscuits into the oven. Chris just shrugged. "Guess I'm out of flinches?" That wasn't entirely true. The ache hadn't vanished. It lived in the quiet hours. Late nights when he lay on his cot at the shelter, staring at the stained ceiling, wondering if he'd ever be more than the guy who got left behind. But now, the ache was just background noise, not the main character anymore. Then came the letter. It wasn't handwritten, but printed clean, formal font on stiff cream paper. No return address, just his name, Christopher Halloway, typed neatly at the center. The envelope was waiting for him at the shelter's front desk, and Roy, the shelter supervisor, raised an eyebrow when he handed it over. "Fancy stuff. You got a secret admirer?" Chris chuckled, but unease had already started curling in his stomach. He took it to the cot, sat on the edge, and hesitated before opening it. There was something about the weight of the envelope, the way his name was typed like it was part of a resume. It didn't feel friendly. When he finally tore it open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a single page. "Chris, we're sorry. We didn't mean to hurt you. Rachel's not doing well. Neither are any of us, really. We miss you. Please call, please. Eliza." Eliza, the quiet one. The one who never laughed at him out loud but never stood up for him either. Chris read it 3 times each time. His chest felt tighter. He could picture them. Rachel, Eliza, Stephanie, sitting around some table, drafting this pathetic olive branch like it was a PR letter. He wanted to be angry. He was angry. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. That little boy inside him who still wanted someone to say they were sorry and mean it, who wanted it to not be a game, not a setup. But he'd grown since the gas station, since the betrayal. Instead of reacting, Chris folded the letter in half, then again. He tucked it under his mattress without a word, no reply, not yet. That night, he couldn't sleep. His chest felt like it was full of gravel, thoughts grinding against each other. He got up before dawn, laced his boots, and went to the diner early. The sun hadn't even cracked the sky yet. Martha found him already prepping eggs and potatoes. "You're early," she said, tying on her apron. "I needed to be somewhere that doesn't talk back," he answered, cracking eggs into a bowl. She didn't ask more. She never did. The rush hit just after 7 a.m. Regulars came in, nodding at Chris like he'd always been here, like he hadn't been broken in half months before. That helped. Their small talk, their orders, their lives moving forward. It made us feel like maybe he could move too. And that's when it happened. Rachel called. Again. This time, he saw her name flash across the screen as he was wiping down a table. His hands froze mid-motion. He didn't answer, but he didn't delete it either. He listened to the voicemail after his shift, sitting on a milk crate in the alley behind the diner. The sun dipping low, her voice trembled. "Chris, I don't know what to say anymore. I was stupid, we all were. I think about you every day. Please don't hate me. Please, just let me know you're okay." Chris closed his eyes. He let her voice wash over him like cold water, and when the message ended, he just whispered, "I am okay." He stood up, went back inside, and grabbed another rag. There were tables to clean, dishes to wash, and a life to finish rebuilding. A real life, with or without her. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he was ready to keep going. Chapter 9, The Decision Point. The letter from Eliza and the voicemail from Rachel hadn't left Chris's mind all week. He went about his shifts like a ghost, doing the job, smiling when expected, but inside, everything was noise. The ache had grown sharper again, more urgent. Not because he missed them, but because part of him hated that he still cared at all. One afternoon, while scrubbing the flat top, Chris looked up and caught his reflection in the greasy metal hood. His eyes were tired, shoulders tense. His hands didn't shake like they used to, but something inside still did. He didn't look like the guy who got left at a gas station anymore. Not completely, but he didn't look free either. Martha noticed. She always did. "You gonna tell me what's going on? Or do I gotta guess again?" she asked, arms crossed, dish towel over one shoulder. Chris hesitated. He didn't want to open the dam, but it was cracking anyway. "They sent a letter," he said quietly, "and a voicemail, saying they're sorry. That Rachel's not doing well." Martha's brow furrowed. "You believe them?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he wiped the grill down in slow circles. Then finally, "I don't know. That's the worst part. A piece of me still wants to, and that's the piece I don't trust." Martha sighed, stepping closer. "Sometimes the part of us that still wants to believe, that's the same part that got hurt in the first place. Don't let it drive." Chris nodded, but the conflict wouldn't die. That night, back at the shelter, he pulled the letter back out from under the mattress and reread it. It was short, careful. It didn't scream sincerity, but it didn't feel fake either. And Rachel's voicemail, the way her voice cracked near the end, how she paused like she was waiting for him to reply, it haunted him. He could feel the decision looming: reach out and risk being pulled back into their mess, stay silent, and maybe miss the closure he'd never had. Neither option felt clean, both carried weight. He tried to distract himself, helped Roy unload donations, fixed a broken hinge on one of the shelter's doors, scrubbed the diner's walk-in fridge until his fingers went numb. But nothing helped. One evening, after a long shift, Chris bought himself a black coffee and sat outside the gas station where he'd first been abandoned. Just sat there, same cracked pavement, same flickering sign above the door. The ghosts were thick in the air. He remembered pacing right there, looking at the road, hoping to see their car come back. The pain of that moment still burned behind his ribs. That was the version of himself who would have forgiven anything, just to not be alone. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He took out his prepaid phone, thumb hovering over the call log. Rachel's number was still there, Eliza's, too. He stared at them for a long while. Then he did something different. He opened a blank text and typed, "I got your message. I'm okay, but I don't think we should talk." No punctuation, no explanation, just enough. He hit send before he could change his mind. And as soon as he did, the pressure in his chest loosened, not gone, but lighter. Back at the shelter, Roy was waiting for him at the door. "Long walk?" Chris just nodded. Roy tilted his head and said, "Looks like you let go of something." Chris didn't answer. He just smiled faintly and walked past. Ready to sleep, the message was out. The door wasn't just closed. It was locked, and for the first time since being left behind, Chris didn't feel like he was waiting for anything anymore. Chapter 10, Turning Point. 2 weeks passed since Chris sent that final text. He hadn't heard back. No reply, no call, no second attempt at first. He checked his phone compulsively, expecting them to push harder. But then, the silence became comforting, empowering. Like the world had finally gone quiet. Jacqueline's diner hummed on. The grill sizzled, the plates clattered, and the smell of coffee and fried bacon filled the mornings. Chris was back in rhythm. Steady hands, focused eyes. He didn't flinch anymore when someone said his name. He'd even started laughing again. Martha noticed the shift first. She slid a plate of pancakes across the counter one morning, giving him a knowing look. "You're sleeping better," she said flatly. Chris smirked. What gave me away? The lack of zombie eyes or the fact that I'm not burning the toast anymore? Both, she replied. Also, you don't look like a guy expecting ghosts to show up anymore. Chris didn't answer, but she was right. The anxiety, the kind that wrapped around his spine like barbed wire, it had started to unravel. One slow afternoon, Jacqueline pulled him aside. Her tone was different, less bark, more curiosity. "You ever thought about something more permanent?" she asked, arms crossed, leaning on the doorframe to the storage room. "Like?" Chris raised an eyebrow. "Full-time benefits. Maybe even training for management. You've got the spine for it." "And the hands?" She gestured at him with a chin nod. Chris blinked. It hit him unexpectedly hard. This woman, tough as nails, sharp-tongued, no nonsense, was offering him something stable, real. Not pity, not rescue, a future. I don't know what to say," he muttered. "Say yes," she replied simply, then disappeared into the kitchen. That night, Chris stood on the roof of the shelter. He'd found a little ladder that led up, and on warm nights, he liked to climb it and sit there, watching the lights of Grand Junction flicker in the distance. The sky stretched out endless above him. For once, it didn't feel heavy. He pulled out his phone, not to check messages, not to scroll, but to look at the lock screen, a photo of the mountains he'd taken during one of his walks, a reminder that he was still here, still climbing. His thoughts drifted, not to Rachel or Eliza, not even to the day they left him, but to who he was becoming. Every shift at the diner, every kind word from Martha, every lesson Jacqueline barked his way, it was building him back up, brick by brick. Chris thought about the old version of himself, the one who'd laugh too quietly, speak too carefully, constantly walking on eggshells around people who never truly saw him. That version had been left at the gas station, and maybe that was the best thing that ever happened to him. He didn't have everything figured out. He still had a cot at the shelter, still had secondhand shoes with a small hole near the toe, still woke up some mornings with a pit in his stomach. But for the first time in years, he had direction, and when he whispered the word yes to the empty sky above him, saying yes to the job, to the diner, to himself, it echoed in his chest like a promise. Chapter 11. A place to belong. The next morning, Chris woke up before his alarm. Not because of the creaky springs of the shelter cot, or the quiet snoring from the guy next to him, but because of something else, hope. He sat up slowly, the early light barely creeping through the dusty shelter window. His body ached, his back sore from months of bad sleep, but his mind felt clear for the first time in so long. He wasn't just surviving the day, he was ready for it. At the diner, Jacqueline didn't say much when he walked in early. She just gave a grunt of approval and slid him the keys to the supply room. That grunt meant something, it meant trust. Chris worked like a man with something to prove, but not to her. Not to anyone else, to himself. He scrubbed the grill until it gleamed, reorganized the back shelves, restocked the napkin dispensers, and prepped ingredients with the precision of someone rebuilding his whole life, one chopped onion at a time. During the lunch rush, Martha leaned over and asked softly, "So, you staying for good?" Chris glanced at her, caught off guard. "What do you mean? You got that look like a man who just found solid ground under his feet for the first time in a long while." He chuckled. "Feels that way sometimes. Don't let go of it," she said, walking off with a tray in hand. After his shift, Chris didn't go back to the shelter right away. He stopped by a small corner store, the kind that smelled like old wood and chewing gum, and bought a cheap notebook and a pen. He took them to a quiet bench just a few blocks from the diner, sat down, and opened the first page. He stared at it for a while, blank, clean, untouched. Then he wrote at the top, What I want my life to be. Underneath, he listed 3 things. 1, my own place. 2, peace. 3, someone who sees me. The words sat heavy on the page, honest and quiet. He closed the notebook and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Like a secret he was keeping just for himself. That night at the shelter, Roy noticed something too. You look different, he muttered, handing Chris his dinner tray. Like you've finally stopped waiting for the sky to fall. Chris smiled. Maybe I have. He ate slowly, savoring the simple warmth of the food. Mashed potatoes and meatloaf, nothing fancy, but it felt like fuel for something more, something real. As he settled into his cot, Chris stared at the ceiling again. But this time, he wasn't haunted by Rachel's face or Eliza's laughter. He thought about the notebook, about that list, and for the first time in a long time, he believed he could actually make it happen. He didn't need revenge anymore. He just needed to keep going. Chapter 12. The Kindness of Strangers. 2 weeks had passed since Chris wrote his list on that quiet park bench. He still carried the notebook everywhere, folded neatly in the inside pocket of his jacket, like a compass pointing him toward something better. Work at the diner remained steady. Jacqueline grew less gruff with him, and even cracked a smile once when he managed to fix a leaky coffee machine without being asked. "You're not useless after all," she muttered, handing him a fresh cinnamon roll. Chris grinned. That was her version of a compliment. Back at the shelter, Roy pulled him aside one morning with a folded flyer in hand. Community church runs a weekly program, he said, helps folks with job training and housing leads. Figured it's time you got off that cot. Chris blinked. You really think I'm ready? Roy looked him dead in the eye. Son, you've been ready. You just forgot. That hit him right in the chest. He took the flyer with shaking fingers. The program met every Saturday afternoon in a church basement that smelled like lemon cleaner and old carpet. Chris didn't know what to expect. A sermon. Maybe instead, he found folding chairs, coffee in styrofoam cups, and a group of people who actually listened when he talked. There was an older man named Greg, who used to work in construction until an injury knocked him off his feet. A single mom named Keisha, juggling night shifts and 2 kids. And then there was Lydia. She was different. Young, sharp-eyed, with a soft voice and a clipboard always in hand. She ran the program, jotting notes as people talked, offering real help instead of pity. After Chris shared a bit of his story, skipping the gas station and betrayal part, but mentioning the shelter and the diner, she pulled him aside. "You're working?" she asked. He nodded. "You have any debt? Addictions?" "No," he said, "just history." She smiled. "History we can work with." By the end of the meeting, she handed him a packet of rental listings and a voucher for a security deposit through the program. Chris felt his throat tighten. That night, he stared at the packet under the flickering shelter light, his fingers tracing the edges like it might disappear if he blinked too long. A studio apartment, tiny. Sure, but it had a door that locked and a window that let in real sunlight. He turned to Roy. "Think this is real?" Roy chuckled. "Only one way to find out." The next morning, Chris put on his cleanest shirt, combed his hair with his fingers, and walked across town to the listed address. A weathered building with chipping paint. But the woman showing it smiled kindly and didn't flinch when he said he was from the shelter. She handed him the key after a short tour and a handshake. And just like that, he had a place of his own. No more cots, no more snoring strangers, no more ghosts clinging to his dreams. He stood in the middle of the empty room that afternoon, the walls bare, the floor creaking under his boots, and let out a breath that felt like it had been stuck in his chest for 5 years. He dropped his bag on the floor, opened the window, and just listened. Silence. Freedom. That night, Chris didn't go back to the shelter. He bought a second-hand blanket and a pillow with the tips he'd saved from the diner, laid them out on the hardwood floor, and fell asleep with the moonlight washing over him through the window. No nightmares. Just peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he belonged. Chapter 13. Echoes from the Past. Chris's new place wasn't much. A creaky floor, yellowed walls, and a heater that hissed like it was angry to be alive. But to him, it felt like a palace. No one snoring nearby, no coughs in the dark, no whispers about what tomorrow might bring. Just him, his thoughts, and a locked door between him and the world. He spent the first few nights curled up on his blanket on the floor, watching shadows crawl across the ceiling. The silence was heavy at first, almost too much after months surrounded by constant noise. But with time, that silence became comforting, safe, a clean slate. Each morning, he'd brew instant coffee on a tiny hot plate he'd picked up for $5. Then head off to the diner. Jacqueline noticed something different in him. "You're walking like a man who finally owns his own damn shoes," she muttered one morning, tossing him a fresh apron. Chris smiled. "Maybe I do." He started working extra shifts, covering when people called out, even helping Jacqueline with inventory. He still wasn't good with people. The regulars mostly got a nod or a quick refill, but the quiet rhythm of work kept his hands and mind busy. Then, one Thursday afternoon, it happened. The bell above the diner door jingled, and a group walked in. A group that made Chris freeze mid-scrub behind the counter. "Chloe, Stephanie, ella." His heart dropped straight into his stomach. They looked older. Stephanie had deep lines around her mouth now, and Ella wore sunglasses indoors, trying too hard to look important. Chloe. She had a tiredness in her eyes he'd never seen before, like life had caught up to her and taken more than she was willing to give. They didn't see him at first. They slid into a booth, laughing too loudly, scanning the menu like they hadn't already made up their minds. It was all so normal, so grotesquely normal, and Chris felt the old ache stir in his chest, the memory of that gas station. The sun in his eyes, the sound of tires on gravel, and his heart shattering in silence. He stepped back, wiping his hands, watching from the kitchen doorway. Then Chloe turned. Her eyes met his. She froze. So did he. Stephanie followed her gaze and smirked. Well, if it isn't the ghost of Grand Junction," she said with a low chuckle. Chris said nothing. His body was stone, but inside, a war. Chloe slowly rose from the booth. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Chris." He didn't answer, just stared. I didn't know you were here. We didn't mean to." "To what?" Chris asked finally, his voice low, cold. "Didn't mean to leave me at a gas station? Didn't mean to laugh about it after." Ella lowered her sunglasses, clearly uncomfortable. "We thought you were fine. We heard you made it back eventually." Chris clenched his fists. They thought he was fine? He could still feel the hunger in his stomach that first night. The panic, the shame, the bone-deep loneliness, and they had been laughing. Chloe stepped closer. "I was wrong, Chris, about everything. I've thought about that day every week since. I messed up. I let them. You chose them," he said flatly. "You chose to laugh. You chose to drive away." Stephanie rolled her eyes. "Okay, this is pathetic. We came in for lunch, not drama." Chloe glared at her, then looked back at Chris. "Please, can we just talk?" He shook his head. "I'm not your punchline anymore." Without another word, Chris turned and walked back into the kitchen, the weight of 5 years lifting off his shoulders like smoke in the breeze. Chloe called after him, but he didn't stop. He had dishes to clean, orders to prep, a life to live, and they were just echoes now. Chapter 14, The Cost of Closure. Chris leaned against the back door of the diner, the alley behind him quiet except for the soft hum of a dumpster fan. His heart was pounding. Not from fear, but from the weight of the moment that had just passed. Chloe, Stephanie, Ella sitting in his diner, looking at him like time hadn't passed, like they could just walk back into his life as if they hadn't left him broken on a roadside. He pulled a cigarette from the pack he kept in the kitchen drawer. Not because he smoked, but because sometimes holding one helped him feel in control. He let it hang from his lips, unlit, as he stared up at the fading sky. For years, he'd imagined what he'd say to them. Punched-up speeches, dramatic walk-offs, even a scene where he flipped a table and stormed out like in the movies. But what really happened? He looked Chloe in the eyes and told her the truth. She chose them, and now she'd have to live with that. He didn't owe her closure. She had all the chances in the world to do right by him. Instead, she laughed when he hurt, left when he was vulnerable, covered her betrayal in tears and excuses now that her life had fallen apart. Chris walked back into the diner. Jacqueline was waiting by the grill, arms crossed, eyebrow raised. "You good?" He nodded. "They're gone." "Yeah, but are you?" He didn't answer right away, just pulled off his apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter. Then he looked Jacqueline in the eye. "I think I am." She gave him a firm nod, the kind of nod that meant respect without saying it out loud. Later that night, Chris found himself walking aimlessly through the quiet streets of Grand Junction. The town that once felt like a punishment had become a home, a place where he rebuilt himself from the ground up, piece by painful piece. He thought about Chloe's eyes, how different they looked today. Not cruel, but tired, hollow. Her marriage had fallen apart. Her business failed, and now she'd come back to the only person she once thought was beneath her, asking for a handout. Chris didn't even feel satisfied. Not in the way he thought he would. There was no revenge that could fix the past. But there was something better. Peace. He had work in the morning, bills to pay, Sienna to wake up next to, a life to hold with both hands. He didn't need closure from Chloe. He was the closure, and maybe the best part? He didn't even want to tell her that. Chapter 15. The Life That Chose Me. It was a Sunday morning, and the sky outside Chris's bedroom window glowed a soft orange. The kind of morning that didn't beg to be rushed. Sienna was still asleep beside him, her breathing slow and peaceful, tangled in the sheets, her hair spilling over the pillow like ink across a page. Chris lay still, one hand behind his head, staring at the ceiling. 15 years ago, he'd woken up cold, alone, and forgotten. Abandoned at a gas station with no money, no phone, and no dignity. Today, he woke up warm, loved, and whole. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Downstairs, the smell of coffee started wafting up. Their new coffee machine with the timer he'd finally saved up for. It was a silly thing, a machine that brewed on a schedule, but it symbolized something bigger. Routine, comfort, home. He got up quietly, trying not to wake Sienna, and padded down to the kitchen. Their daughter's crayons were still scattered across the table from last night, drawings of cats and hearts and suns with smiling faces covering half the placemats. Their son's toy trucks were lined up like a military formation along the baseboard. He smiled, running a hand through his hair, the grays more visible now. But he didn't mind them anymore. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, the kind that bit just a little at your nose but still smelled like possibility. Chris sat down on the wooden steps, took a sip, and let the silence settle over him. Chloe hadn't reached out again. Not since the check. Not since he'd looked her in the eyes and said everything she needed to hear without raising his voice. She had walked out of his life a second time, but this time it was on his terms. The peace that came after wasn't loud. It was quiet and grounding. He didn't need a parade. He didn't need applause. He didn't even need her regret. He had Sienna. He had the diners. Now his diners. Full of regulars who smiled when he walked in and asked how the kids were doing. He had Jacqueline, who still dropped by sometimes with her gravelly voice and a bag of her famous cinnamon rolls, pretending they were just extras. He had Roy, who had once handed him a form and a chance when no one else would. He had a life that wasn't about proving Chloe wrong anymore. It was about proving himself right. Right to fight for better, right to walk away, right to heal, right to choose love that chose him back. Sienna stepped out behind him, still in her robe, and sat beside him without saying anything at first. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the sunrise together like they had so many quiet mornings before. After a while, she whispered, "You okay?" He turned to her, really looked at her, at the woman who had seen the mess of him and still reached out her hand. "I'm more than okay," he said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," and he meant it. For the first time in his entire life, Chris didn't feel like he was surviving. He was living.